We're going to go through all the phases of retirement. We'll talk about each of them individually, do a nice overview of all the phases. I think everyone can benefit from that type of large-scale overview. And then we're going to zoom in. We're going to look specifically at the early years of retirement, the first couple of years of retirement, and we'll provide some details, some tips of how to handle those initial years. You retire, then what, right? We're going to help answer that question, do a deep dive on that phase of the whole retirement program, all the different phases of retirement. We'll start by looking, well, actually, before I get too far ahead here, Kevin, you got to keep the folks happy. You got to keep the lawyers in check here. Exactly. So I do have to provide the disclaimer on the screen here. I'll make it large so everyone can see some of the detail there. And we'll get going here. We'll start talking about the different phases. We'll start with that large-scale overview that I talked about and then dive deeply into the one beginning phase, that early active phase of retirement. So here are the 5 phases. So make this large so everyone can see. You can see before retirement, we got 2 of the 5 phases there. You have the accumulation phase, which is largely habit-based. You're spending less than you're making. You're putting some money aside. You're also paying down debt. And then when you get, give or take 15 years from retirement, well, now you're worrying about, have you saved enough? You're doing more forecasts to see what does that retirement plan really look like. That's the pre-retirement phase, the yellow circle. Then you actually get into retirement. You can see the active, passive, supported, the green, blue, and purple circles on the chart there. And we'll go through all of them, and then we'll dive deep into that green circle, the early or the active phase of retirement. But let's start with a little overview that can help out everyone that goes through all the phases, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, before we dive into the area that we're going to really concentrate on tonight, I think we should describe exactly all 5 of those phases, pre-retirement as well as when you're into the retirement scenario. And the first phase on this whole situation is the accumulation phase. Now, this is the longest phase. It can be anywhere from your 20s to your 60s. So it could be 40 years encompassing, or it could be less than that. This is the longest phase of the career. It's different than all the other ones. Each phase has a different sort of time frame, but this is the longest one because it's early time frame. So you're getting a mortgage, you may have life insurance, you're taking advantage of your work scenario, you may be building a family, the whole 9 yards, getting established in your career, you may be having a mortgage, paying down that debt, and you're basically building the good habits of saving going forward. After that, we then enter the pre-retirement phase, which of course happens sort of 15 years before retirement. So it could be your mid-40s, could be your early 50s. It's still part of the accumulation phase, and the fact that you still have money that you're saving away and focusing on, but there's a little bit of a difference there. Maybe the mortgage is done, or debt repayment is almost down. You're paying for kids' education, or maybe that's all covered. You're increasing your savings rate to make sure that you can start dealing with things. But the biggest factor is you're starting to focus on that retirement budget. That's a big one. You're starting to figure out, what am I going to need in retirement? What am I going to do? From there, we then enter into retirement. All of a sudden, we get to that first phase, which is the early retirement or active phase. Now, this is usually from when you start retirement to your early 70s. For most folks, again, this is when you're still active. You're still mobile. You still have everything going on. You want to travel. You want to do hobbies. You may have part-time work. But basically, you're taking that pre-retirement lifestyle and you're moving it into the early retirement. So the biggest factors you're concentrating on, the 4 are your budget, your health benefits, you're adjusting to the new routine because you're no longer a work person, you're now a retirement person, and you're looking at how to tax efficiently withdraw money that you've been saving for years. This is a very important phase, and these are the big 4 factors you got to look at for that. After your early retirement, of course, you move to that mid-retirement stage. You're settling in. I mean, routine has been there for a while. You're probably in your late 70s to 80s. You're less active. You're not as mobile as you used to be. Travel there is not as big a deal. And your living accommodations. All of a sudden, you know, the big house with 2 stories, maybe stairs become a difficulty, or, you know, yard work that you wanted to do isn't there anymore. So you're looking at other alternatives, and you're starting to plan that estate and making tax planning situations going forward. Finally, you hit to more of that later retirement, or what we call the supported phase. And this is often when your costs start to increase again. And the reason is, you're acquiring healthcare. Maybe you're living in a new retirement home and there's a lot of cost to deal with that. You're getting meals made for you. You're not moving around as much, or you're not going as many places. And again, the big financial focus at this point is basically the estate and tax planning there. You're not worried about the accumulation or withdrawing enough money. So these are sort of the 5 phases in more of a nutshell scenario, giving you that sort of high-end look as to what each one is. And we'll concentrate on one a little bit more.
Yeah, and before we get into them there, how do you progress through the phases is a common question. And it does vary because the phases are not all the same length. It'd be nice if there's a nice organized schedule so you know what to focus on exactly when and you can plan it so far in advance, but that's not the case. For the 2 phases prior to retirement, and I'll pull this back up so that everyone can see, you got the accumulation and the pre-retirement phase. For those ones, what progresses from one to the other has more to do with age and with wealth. As you're accumulating more wealth, you have more finances. Well, you're out of the accumulation phase, more into the pre-retirement. Also with age, when you give or take 15 years from your targeted retirement date, well, you're probably in that pre-retirement phase. And then during retirement, what determines the progression from one phase to the other has to do with health. Unfortunately, that's simply the case. Early retirement, you're going to be in good health. You're going to be very active. And then as health kind of deteriorates a little bit, you get into the middle portion of retirement. And then the latter years is when you're going to need a little bit of assistance with health care and in a more of a supported phase. So we don't know how long those phases are going to be. So it's hard to plan exactly from one to the other. It's going to be the health that determines the length and how you progress across the 5 phases. But we did talk about that early retirement phase. We're going to zoom in on that one. So in the first couple of years of retirement, what should we focus on? We had mentioned 4 key items there, Kevin. We talked about budget, talked about health benefits, mentioned tax efficient withdrawals and adjusting to the new routine going through that transition. We'll start with the big B. We'll start with that budget and dive in there.
Yeah, I mean, basically, that's the other factor. When we go to the budget, we're going to look at how we want to plan for what we're going to do when we hit that early retirement phase. And what we want to deal with here is the retirement smile scenario. Now, this is a study that's been done by David Blachent and Morningstar, and they're looking at government data and spending estimates for various income levels. As we can see, the blue line's 25,000 spent, the red's 50,000 spent, and the green line's 100,000 spent. And what we're finding just by looking at this is sort of that you get that big focus there that right in the beginning, your early retirement, you're spending your money. Whatever your pre-retirement budget is, you're basically spending that in retirement because that's the early phase. I mean, you're still in that honeymoon sort of scenario. You're traveling maybe more, you're visiting friends, you're going out and having dinners, you're still dealing with that entertainment. So we're seeing that sort of right through to the 70s is that spending is still sort of there. Then when you get to that sort of mid 70s or late 70s to early 80s, you're starting to see that the spending's going less. Again, as we mentioned, maybe you're not leaving home as often, or you're moving to another place because of your housing accommodations, just stairs don't work or things like that. You're also finding the fact that, maybe I'm not traveling as much. I'm not going out as much because I'm not as mobile as I used to be. So all of a sudden your costs start to reduce quite a bit. And then when we see sort of that late 80s, 90s and upward, all those costs start to ramp up again. Again, as we mentioned beforehand, what you're starting to see is, well, maybe I'm paying for a seniors care home that I'm in, or I'm paying for healthcare. I'm getting meals made and things along those lines, or I have medical situations where I need to pay for prescriptions and stuff along that line. But basically what this whole scenario shows is that you get a smile out of it. You're spending a lot in the beginning, you go down a little in the middle, and then you're spending a lot at the end, that U-shaped form. But one thing that's really important to notice on this whole scenario is it doesn't matter what income level you have, you tend to have the same scenario. It's age related more than it is income related. So the 50,000 is spending the same as 100, same as 25 at the same sort of time frames. So what we're really getting out of this chart and this data study is that the data we're getting here is backing up our 3 phases of retirement: the active, the passive, as well as the supportive in that sort of scenario. So our big scenario to remember is that, we don't have to plan for 82 right to the penny or anything along those lines. We have some sort of fluctuation we can deal with. But what we really need to notice is that we're focusing on a pre-retirement lifestyle. And that is the first retirement phase, is focusing on what your pre-retirement is, getting you in to your retirement and how your active portion of early retirement is going to last.
Yes, we're looking at the early retirement, that first phase of retirement, and we're going through some of the tips. And when we talk about budget, there's a few good takeaways there. And one I'm going to hit right away is you got to be realistic with your spending habits. Often, one thing we see is perhaps someone has a target date of retirement of 65, and they get to 62 and decide, if I cut this out of the budget, I cut down a little over here, it works. The forecast is on track, I can retire right away, which is not a good idea. It's harder than you think to change those habits. So to be realistic with the routine, with the spending habits, to actually just get an accurate reflection of what you're currently doing is a better idea than to try to cut and make it fit a particular retirement date. And if you're really realistic about that, one thing to be aware of is you don't have to be to the penny accurate. Like some folks will come back and say, hey, we spend $5,320.15 every month. Well, that's fantastic if you do track it to that level, but not required, right? We're looking for an accurate ballpark estimate when it comes to the budget. So try to get a good idea of the spending habits, looking at the pre-retirement lifestyle, and get it within a couple $100 a month. That would be fairly accurate. And then, of course, and this is a big one, it's not set in stone. You can adjust as you go through the phases of retirement. Certainly that first phase that we're talking about, in that first phase, you want to update the budget within 12 to 24 months because you're adjusting to the new routine. There could be a lot going on as you set the new routine, and the consumption patterns, the spending patterns also adjust. So you want to make sure the budget's accurate and a reflection of that. And then even throughout retirement, you don't have to continually do it every single year or 2 years, but you do it perhaps initially 12 to 24 months after retirement, and then you update every 4 or 5 years. And that'll be one of the indicators of how you go through the phases. You'll notice the spending patterns will adjust, and you can update your financial plan accordingly. So that's a little tip for the early phase, as well as something you could do throughout retirement as you go through the different phases. So we covered budget there. A reminder, those 4 pieces we're going to look at as a result of those early years of retirement. Budget was the first one, and then health benefits here, Kevin, an often overlooked area, is number 2 on that list.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big factor that we got to talk about. Every time we ask somebody to say, well, we need to know what your retirement budget's going to be. So they go through it, they look at what they spend on food, cable, what they spend on hydro, entertainment, but nobody ever forecasts what their health benefit costs are. And again, a lot of this has to deal with when you work. Most of your health benefits are taken off before you ever see the money go into your bank account. So you just know that they're there and you don't think about them. But when retirement comes, it's a completely different situation. 9 times out of 10, a lot of people are not going to have those benefits once they end. So you should start thinking about where your health benefits are going to be. Now, some plans at your work may allow you to carry on, but they usually have a short window for when you can accept that as well. Maybe in 90 days, you have to decide. And if you don't do it then you have to start searching for plans. One thing to remember about these plans, though, is that no one size fits all. Everybody can have a plan that's sort of tailor-made to them. You can find healthcare plans outside of what you had at work, and they can include prescriptions. They can include whether or not you need dental and how much dental you need. They can also be a travel scenario. If you plan on making a whole bunch of trips, what is the travel insurance and where can I get it? And these can be more custom designed closely to what you want in some format, and that you'll have to pay for depending on what it is. But again, having those healthcare sort of scenarios is really nice. Now, there was a study done in 2014 by BMO Wealth Institute report, and basically it said that without healthcare, private coverage, average out-of-pocket medical costs for Canadian over 65 was $53.91. Now, that is 9 years ago. So you can only imagine what those costs are going to be today. It has become fairly expensive if you need healthcare and you don't have a plan. So this is one thing you really have to consider. And what do? You start planning for your healthcare stuff pre-retirement so that when you do hit retirement, that's when the decision's made as to what you want. So it's very important that you make sure you look at what your health coverage is now, what kind of health coverage you think you're going to need in retirement, and then plan for that accordingly. Because again, as I've mentioned, when we set that list out of what are your expenses, almost nobody includes this because they don't think of it at the time, and that's something that we have to take a look at.
Yeah, health benefits is not a frequent item on there. You're absolutely right. So often when people list the expenses, we have to remind them, hey, you're probably gonna need some kind of health benefit package. And then as well, just a comment on what's on the screen here. Kevin mentioned 2014 BMO Wealth Institute report. So 2014 is a while ago. Costs have changed a little bit in that. And also this is an average. You'll notice it says over 65 plus. So some people part of the study were in their 80s, some were in their 70s. And people are gonna have different needs at different points in retirement. But unfortunately, if you wait until, say, you're 75 and now you have more healthcare needs, it's going to be far more expensive to get coverage than if you did it early on. And this is just meant as a baseline. As Kevin mentioned, there's no one size fits all, just to give you a little more context on that data point. So we covered 2. We mentioned health benefits, talked a little bit about budget. We're going to tie it all together here as we start talking about the emotional transition, or just the general transition into retirement. And there's a lot of pieces that come into retirement. A lot of times we focus on the financial side, right? And so far, that's what we've done too, talking about budgets, talking about health benefits and cost. And often a lot of the marketing around retirement does the exact same thing. It shows people on the dock, people on the golf course, they're spending money, they're not worrying about it. And I understand the financial freedom aspect of retirement. That's certainly important, but also to keep in mind, and I mention this because the emotional side does actually impact the financial side. So you have to be aware of both. But it is a new role. It is an adjustment. You are going into a new routine. It is a change. It's a change in lifestyle. For some folks, it can be a larger change. Others handle it in a different regard. So everyone's a little different, but certainly something to keep in mind. A little bit of study here, a bit of data to help provide some context on that transition. You have Robert C. Atchley. That's the top portion of the slide here I'm referring to. He was a sociologist in the US. A lot of his work was done in the 70s and in the 80s. He came up with an adjustment model for retirement. He viewed it as people taking on a new role in life, and that they'd go through different stages of how they adjusted to that new role. You can see some of the steps there. There'd be a honeymoon period, and then you'd have maybe a disenchantment when the reality really set in, and then you finally adjust. You get the reorientation, and you get into a new retirement routine. So he had that theory, the model, and then you had some data study by Reitz and Mutran. That was in the early 2000s, about 20 years back, but they followed people around for about 2 years, the first 2 years of retirement, to see, well, how did things change? What was their attitude like toward retirement, their contentment level? They went through a couple of steps. Now, their model they were testing had 5 stages. Atchley's had 6. There is a bit of a difference there, but the data essentially backed up that adjustment period, and it backed up the idea that people go through this transition as they adapt to a new role. And I'll put up a couple of details here. This is the study. Reitz and Mutran created a graph based on their data, and you can see a pretty good pattern there, Kevin. You can see a bit of the honeymoon phase. Hey, we're retired. It's like vacation. We're loving it. You see this peak of positive attitudes towards retirement about 6 months in, and then a bit of a drop, a little bit of a decline as you get into that disenchantment phase, and the reality of the new situation kind of sets in, that it's not all roses and puppy dogs, or if life still happens. And then eventually you get the reorientation, and you'll notice as those positive attitudes recover, they don't surpass the prior peak, but they do certainly come back up. And this adjustment portion can take time. Some people it takes a year, some people it takes 18 months, 2 years. Everyone's a little different, but the idea is that this can impact your spending. So as you go through these different phases, what you're spending money on and the overall level of spending could also change. So we talked about updating your budget in the early years of retirement within 12 to 24 months. This is part of the reason why. It's because as you go through that adjustment period, it could impact what happens on the financial side. It can impact your spending. So be aware of it. Everyone's going to be a little different. There's no magic solution to make it just go away. You kind of just have to go through it and adjust to the new routine. But if you have your expectations properly set and you understand that this can impact the financial side, and then you update your budget 12 to 24 months in, once that new routine is kind of set, you'll be on a good track. But we're talking about transition here, Kevin. We're going to talk about being happy in retirement. So let's add a little more data.
Yeah, I mean, that's another factor. I mean, as you mentioned, retirement is not strictly a financial scenario. It's also an emotional one. And as you mentioned through that process, I mean, permanent vacation to begin with, that's great. And all of a sudden it sets in that, wow, this is just not permanent vacation anymore. I've had my 6 months of vacation. Now I got to set myself in reality. But what they actually have to happen and take a look at for your entire retirement is there was a survey that was done by AgeWave, and they were asked to select a number of different ones. You didn't have to select just one reason why you would have a healthy and happy retirement. You could select a variety of them. And what we really find out, especially from this study right here, is that financial security is not the most important thing in retirement. It's health. And again, if you take a look at any of the commercials that have ever been on TV, they show, as you've mentioned, there's people fishing. They've gone on vacation. They're sitting on a beach somewhere. They're enjoying life that way. They're playing pickleball. They're doing a variety of other things. The only way you can do a lot of that stuff is if you have some good health to begin with. You're active, you're mobile, you can do it. Even in seniors' homes, they mention all the different plans that you can have. People are having dinner with friends and everything else. So everybody figured that the best thing that's gone on, you need to have good health to have a happy retirement. Now, don't get me wrong, financial security is definitely a piece of this, and you have to have some form of a financial plan to be able to go forward with your retirement. And again, as we mentioned, loving family and friends, you combine all of that. That's the biggest factor that's going to go on with your healthy and happy retirement. But it is an emotional scenario. You have to have some sort of health. As they mentioned, you can't buy health. That's the one thing that, you know, everybody would give up the money if they could have health to go on and on and on. But financial security is there. So as we mentioned, it is an emotional scenario. Don't just concentrate on the money aspect. You need to be able to have good health going forward, whether that's taking care of medical and starting to look at it in your pre-market years. So getting into that sort of routine for exercise, making sure you have those hobbies that you want to do outside that can keep you in good health, eating the right things. All of those are important to maintaining a happy and healthy retirement.
Yeah, it's all part of the transition, all part of establishing that new routine. And a reminder, I know Kevin and I are kind of going through these different topics at a rapid pace. We are recording this, so you can always come back and watch it on a YouTube page. Or if you have questions right now, you can type it in to the comment section. Be happy to address them as we go. But we zoomed in on the early retirement phase, those first couple of years of retirement, often called the active phase. We're covering 4 key points that are related to that transition in the first few years. We talked about budget. That's a big one. We talked about health benefits, one that's often forgotten about, but is important. And then simply acknowledging that it is a transition, looked at a little bit of data to provide context around that transition. We're now going to talk about tax efficiency, specifically when you're taking money out of the account. And we'll cover this from a couple of ways. Before I dig into kind of the financial details, which are important, and we are going to go through a financial example, I will mention that there is going to be a change. And just like before, there's an emotional piece and a financial piece. Same thing here when you start drawing down your account. There's very much a financial tax piece and how to minimize tax and make sure it makes the most sense. But there is another change on the emotional side from 2 ways. One is about habits and one's about perspective. And I have to keep in mind in the earlier phases of retirement, you're doing the accumulation, you're building good habits, you're spending less, you're saving more, you're paying down debt. You do that for decades. And as you're adding to the account, earning a bit of interest, you see the accounts going up. Maybe not every year, there's the occasional bad one, but overall it's increasing and you're adding money. And then suddenly in retirement, you could see a shift. 2 ways. One, you go from being a saver to a spender. So instead of just saving the money the whole time, you got to kind of shift gears and change your habits. And now you're supposed to start spending, which can be difficult. That adjustment to the new habit, the new routine can be tough. And then also the perspective. You're putting money aside, you're earning interest, you're getting used to seeing your statements, and those account values keep going up. That feels pretty good. That's a nice perspective. Then in retirement, it's very possible that you're going to be spending down the account faster than interest is being earned. And that might work perfectly with your plan. That might achieve all your goals and be perfectly okay. But emotionally, that can be hard to handle when you start seeing the value decline. Even if it's part of the plan, there's a different perspective there. It doesn't feel as good when you're in the accumulation phases and you're seeing things go up. So you have to keep that in mind. Change in perspective when you're seeing the values go up versus down, and then change in habits from being a saver to a spender. That's largely emotional, but it can impact what happens on the financial side. So with that in mind, we'll actually talk about the financial part of drawing down the account, making it tax efficient. A couple of steps. The first step, of course, Kevin, is going to be your need. Hopefully you've done the work earlier. You got the budget sorted out. You know how much money is supposed to be coming in. Now comes the other part of, well, where do we get that money? If I needed, say, $70,000 to meet my needs, that's my budget. Well, I'll get some from CPP, some from old age security. Maybe there's a bit of private pension in addition to that. And then there's going to be a chunk that has to come from the investments. How does that come out of the account? Which account do I take first? Which one do I leave to the end? Well, that's where the order of withdrawals will help out. And that's what's on the screen right now. So where you start at the most taxable accounts. That's our suggestion. So your most taxable accounts, that's your RSP, that's your RIF, your LIRA, your LIF, all the acronym soup there. If you have a corporate account, it would be on the same level as the RSPs as part of those order of withdrawals. So the heavier taxed items, that's where we're going to start. The reason we do that, and we'll go through an example with a little more detail, but the idea being you don't want to die with lots of money in your RSP. You want to try to use that up in bits and pieces so you don't get a big tax bill at the end. So we try to start there. The second level on the order of withdrawals, your non-registered account. If you have a cash account, a joint account, it would fall into that category. And then ideally, we can just maximize the TFSA, and that'll be the last pot of money that we touch, is that tax-free savings account. That one has lots of tax perks. It can go to the next generation very tax efficiently. So hopefully we can leave that one alone and use up the other accounts prior. Now we'll go through an example here to add a little context to this.
Yeah, and I mean, basically, how can you deal with a tax efficiency scenario unless you deal with tax brackets and how it's going to work on the tax system? So as we mentioned before, the income that we're going to look at, let's look at the fact that we want $70,000 of gross income. So as we've mentioned, CPP, OAS, you have a private pension plan, maybe you're earning dividends or interest from a non-registered account. all that gets mixed into your gross income, and then we decide what we need. So if that accounts for, say, 50 grand of that 70, well, now we got to take 20 from somewhere else. And as Clint mentioned beforehand, the best place to start with that, we want to take it out of a registered or a corporate account. And the reason is because those are taxed. And that way, it's all full income to you. You got to pay tax on it. So those are the most efficient ones to take from now, because now you're saving your non-taxable ones for a later time frame. And that's the biggest factor to be able to deal with. So we want to draw the registered ones first, and then we want to draw from anything else beyond that. But there are also certain situations that we may want to take a look at. Let's assume that we lived in Nova Scotia and we were planning a special trip to Hawaii. So as opposed to 70, now we want $80,000. Well, if I want to keep that same sort of scenario, I know that the upper limit there that I've got to deal with is roughly 75,000. Well, I could take an extra 5,000 from my registered account, but then maybe I want to take 5,000 from my TFSA or my non-registered account so that I don't have to pay any more taxes. I'm not jumping up into another new tax bracket, and that will give me the money I need. So as we can see, depending on where the tax bracket is, if I'm sitting there and I'm going to be above it, then maybe I want to draw money that's non-taxable just to be able to make that sort of scenario. Whereas if I take a look at the other scenario, let's say I'm below. Well, if I live in Alberta or Saskatchewan or the Yukon, and we have tons of people watching us, I know, in the Yukon right now.
Hello, Yukon.
We have a large amount of room that we can get there. So getting that 80 is not a problem, but let's face facts as to what's there. If I go to 80, I still have basically another $26,000 worth of room in that tax bracket. Well, maybe what I want to do is what's known as an RSP meltdown. And why would somebody want to do an RSP meltdown or take more money? Well, maybe I'm looking at it from my estate. As Clint mentioned earlier, when you get more money out of your registered account, you don't have to worry about paying taxes on it later down the road. So if you're sitting on a large RSP, $300, $500, $1 million, I mean, if that's all of a sudden you pass away, all that money is going to be taxable because it's all income for that year. So we can take more of it out at a lower tax bracket, then that might be an option that works for you best. So that's the purpose of the RSP meltdown. So not only can we get to the 80, but we could take another 26 in that same tax bracket and move it into a non-registered account, save it for our estate, and help out that way going down the road. So those are obvious things to do. And again, we don't have to do it all at once. I mean, we may be drawing monthly from our RSP or our RIF just so that we can get the money there. Normally on the meltdown scenario, sometime between October and December is when we do that lump sum, just so we have a better idea as to what your expenses are up to that point if we want to cover it that way. So there are aspects that you can deal with depending on where you live and what your upper tax limit is as to how you want to draw money out. But that's a big example as to what we want to do with that gross income.
If we use that Nova Scotia example, if you wanted 80,000, now the slide says 70, but let's assume you need 80. Well, if the top of the bracket's 75 or 74,999, well, maybe you take that extra 5 from a different account, a non-registered or a TFSA, so you stay in the same limit. You don't pay any extra higher amounts on the rate. Or the meltdown scenario you talked about, which is the opposite. Let's say you're under, you say you live in Alberta and you're taking out 70,000 or even 80,000 in terms of your overall gross income. You can take a little extra from the RSP to help melt it down. We do that because RSP is unfortunately very heavily taxed. Or if we go back to this slide, pretty much everything on the top line there can be heavily taxed. So everything on that top line would be related to this meltdown strategy. So instead of just letting it build and build and delaying that tax liability, you get it out in bits and pieces. You do it over time, ideally within the same tax bracket, so the rate's not any higher, and you slowly melt down those accounts. So that order of withdrawals, you start with your need. I should say the steps. The first is starting with the need. How much money do you need? You figure out how much of that comes from the investments. You go through the order of withdrawals on this slide. And then in terms of the amount you actually take out, which could be a little more, a little less, depending on the tax bracket. You let the tax bracket guide the overall amount from that RRSP. So we covered lots. We went through the 5 phases of retirement. Then we zoomed in on that first phase, Kevin, looking at the 4 key points, which was the budget, the health benefits, which are often forgotten. We talked about the transition to retirement, a couple of tips and a few studies and data points there, and then looked at the tax efficient withdrawals because that's often key in the first phases of retirement. Kevin, where can they go to get their questions answered?
They can go to chatwithclintonandkevin.com. We are more than happy to answer any questions you have on the early retirement phase, any of the pre-retirement phases, or any of the stuff that we've discussed tonight. If you have questions that are not related to this, again, anything sort of financial, please send it to us. We'd be more than happy to answer any of those or guide you to the right place dealing with taxes or things along those lines. So, I mean, by all means, answer, give us questions. We are very happy to have anything that we can to try and help you out with your financial situation. There's no cost to send us anything for this. So that's always a nice aspect to have. A lot of people want that. No, we'd be here. We want to make sure that you get the best financial information that you can to help you make the right decisions for your retirement or whatever goals that you're setting out going forward.